Okay, what's up, everybody? Today's workshop is going to be covering the basics of JavaScript. And while there are a lot of features that are useful for web development, we're just going to be covering the basic general language features because once you know those, everything else will be a lot easier to learn. Okay, so what is JavaScript? JavaScript is a programming language just like Java, Python, and C, or anything else you might have learned, but specifically it operates behind the scenes on web pages. So if you're gonna try to learn any advanced web development, I would say that JavaScript is like the most important language you should learn. So unlike C and Java, JavaScript is an interpreted language, which means that it's not going to catch any errors for you, and you just have to run it to check if any bugs are in your program. And unlike Python, which you can run as a script, JavaScript isn't going to be very practical unless you also know HTML. So if you've logged onto a website ever, had it retrieve your information, or even just pushed a button, then you've seen the effects of JavaScript code running. And for now, you can just run short snippets of code. If you're using Chrome, you can right-click a page, inspect it, and then go to the console and type your code there. Or you could just look up a free online code editor, and we provided one here.
So now we're going to be talking about working with simple data. The JavaScript keywords var, let, and const allow us to create variables for storing data values. The use of const allows us to define variables that cannot be reassigned, and the let keyword is used to define a variable with restricted scope. So in this example on the left, we can see that that var greeter is being redefined in the if statement, and that's fine because it's just a variable. But on the right, where we see const greeter is being changed again in the if statement as well, this is going to end up causing a runtime error. Since it's a constant variable, we can't allow it to change. And let greeter in the if statement does not redeclare the variable outside of the if statement. So we can also create a number variable in JavaScript by declaring the variable name and initializing it to some value. And numbers behave as we would expect it with the four basic operations. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division works exactly as how we would expect it to. And if we're storing numbers and variables, we can perform the same exact operations by referencing the variable names. And since JavaScript doesn't type check variables, trying to perform these operations on a variable of the wrong type will give an error. So you have to be careful with every line you write. So sometimes we're going to have to perform more complicated calculations with our numbers, and instead of doing all this from scratch, JavaScript does come with a math library to help us out. So for instance, you can use for absolute values, square roots, floor logs, and so on. So you can definitely refer back to this slide anytime you have to use any of those functions. So booleans can either be true or false. So we can set our variable is Sunny to true and has finished homework to false. And you might be asking yourself, if booleans can only store two values, then why are they so useful? Booleans are powerful in situations where we don't know the answer to a true or false question in advance with 100% certainty. So if a condition may change during the program, or it depends on user interaction, we can use conditional logic to handle the chance that it is true or false. We'll discuss this more later on. So right here, in the example, we have number mod 2 is equal to 0. And if it's true, then the log is going to print out that it's even. However, if it's false, it's going to end up printing that it's odd. So in JavaScript, strings are used for storing and manipulating text. When we create a string, the text must be placed inside single or double quotes. So unlike numbers where we don't have quotes, it's very important that we differentiate the two using double quotes. If we want a number, for example, to be a string, or if we want a number to just be a number, we do it without the double quotes or the single quotes. So because strings must be written within quotes, JavaScript will misunderstand this string right here, where we are the so-called Vikings from the north. You can't exactly do double quotes like that, so to avoid the problem, we're going to use the backslash character to turn special characters into string characters. So we would want to rewrite our example as the following. We can get the lengths of strings with the built-in length property. So if we wanted to know how many letters that there were in the alphabet, you can use your variable, create a new variable called alphabet_length, and then we can use .length to get back the number of numbers in the alphabet. We can also change the case of a string using .to uppercase and .to lowercase. So if we wanted to, we can also change the case of a string using .to uppercase and .to lowercase. So for instance, if we took our variable alphabet again and we dot uppercase it, then all of the letters right here in the alphabet would end up being uppercase characters. And strings can also be compared letter by letter in alphabetical order, but you have to keep in mind that lowercase characters are always greater than the uppercase characters, and this is because of the ASCII value. So if you're not sure exactly which letters correspond to which value, you can definitely just look up the table. So for example, if we used our variable x, which is equal to apple, and our variable y, which is equals to banana, if we wanted to compare if apple is less than banana, we would get back true because the ASCII value of A, uppercase A, is 41, where the value for uppercase B is 42. So this is true where apple is less than banana. So to summarize, in JavaScript, we primarily deal with three types of primitive data. Numbers, where a number can be any positive or negative whole number or decimal. We can perform standard operations with them along with more specific functions. And unlike other programming languages, we don't have to specify whether a number is an integer or a floating point value.
Okay, let's move on to data structures. So unlike primitive data types, which can store one value, we often need to deal with chunks of data. And we use data structures to essentially organize and manipulate different information, such as, say, details about a person, first name, last name, student test scores, or what's in the user's online shopping cart. So the most fundamental data structure in JavaScript is an array, and an array data is stored sequentially and can be accessed by indexes. And arrays in JavaScript can store data with different types, although this is not recommended because this could cause confusion and certain bugs in your code when you try to access an array element with one type where you really meant to access a different array element. So in this example, an array stores a string, numbers, and even a Boolean. So that could cause problems down the line. If you've worked with Java, arrays should be pretty familiar to you. In JavaScript, arrays act like array lists in Java. So they don't check for types and they can have a limited size. So there are multiple methods for arrays built in. We can get the length of the array, we can find elements, and we can push and pop, sort the array. There are more methods in JavaScript that are built in, but these should be the most fundamental ones that you can use. And I think these are pretty straightforward. The next data structure is objects. And objects in JavaScript represent real or abstract objects, and they store key value pairs. And if you work with Java, this is similar to a map. So let's look at this example. So a sports car has a property of make Ferrari and a model of spider. And it can also store actions. So in other words, functions. So the get model is a function that returns this model string. So it would return spider. And this is similar to a getter function in Java. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you should probably know this, but otherwise, this is simply a function that returns a property in the sports car. So objects and arrays are essentially the most fundamental data structures that you would need. And just remember, when you use an object, you need to describe a data with different fields and parameters. And when you use arrays, you probably need to store, sort, or access data such as, let's say, test scores. All right, moving on to comparisons and logical operators.
Okay, so the last big topic we're going to cover is functions and loops. So a function or a method is a piece of code that we can call to perform repetitive tasks and actions more efficiently and with different inputs. So on the right, we can see that we wrote a function that takes in 3 inputs and it takes their product. And we can call this function with different types of input as long as they're numbers, because Java doesn't type check anything. So we need to make sure that the inputs we give it actually work with the operation. And in JavaScript, we have to be careful that the variable names we use in the function don't actually exist outside. So we can't use it anywhere else. And we just have to be careful that we don't pass in anything of the wrong type. Okay, so if we want to run a function, when we defined it, we just described all the actions it's going to do. So we actually have to invoke it now and call it. So the first way we can do this is just by calling the function like we did here. We called update count twice, and it changed the variable count because that's what we defined the function. And then when we're dealing with HTML, we also have the option to bind it to an object, as long as we've connected the JavaScript file, which we'll cover later. And then it'll automatically perform the function whenever that action is called. So the first function example we have is pretty simple. We can just write a function to perform some action. And then when we call it with a string, it's going to print out that string. And then the second example uses inputs. So in this example, we're trying to convert a Fahrenheit temperature to Celsius. And we need a return value. So the function is going to give us back a number that's the value of the conversion. So if we convert 32 degrees Celsius, we're going to get 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And when we have a return statement, any lines of code below that in the function are ignored. So you usually shouldn't have anything there. Okay, so just like how functions isolate repetitive tasks that we want to do, we usually have to perform an action a lot of times, and it just wouldn't be possible to do this manually. So this is where we're going to use loops. And in JavaScript, a for loop has this basic syntax where we have a starting condition. So we can just set a variable, and then we have a terminating condition, which is going to be a logical expression. We check after every loop, and we terminate the second that it's false. And then we can have an increment that we run after every loop. Okay, so for an example of a loop, let's say that we have like a grade book and we want to find the average test score in a class. So if we didn't know how many students were in the class, this would actually be impossible to code manually because we wouldn't know how many variables we have to add up. And even if we did, it would still be very repetitive. So with a for loop, we can go through the same steps we would and add up all the numbers and then divide by how many values we have to get the average. Okay, so if we don't actually know how many times we're going to run exactly, it's oftentimes more useful to write a while loop. So we only have one thing to input to it, which is going to be a logical expression. So it's going to return true or false. And as long as that condition's true, we're going to keep going back and running the loop. So if we look at the chart on the right, it's actually very similar to a for loop. The only difference is that a for loop has an initial condition we add and an increment after every loop. So a lot of the times you can actually write something as a while loop or a for loop in like an equivalent way, but it's just a matter of preference. So as a summary, functions are blocks of code designed to perform a particular task or action, and we can give them inputs so they work a little bit more dynamically. And a JavaScript function is executed when something calls or invokes it. And functions can be used to give us a return value, and it's going to return that to whatever is calling it. Loops are handy when we want to run a block of code over and over, and we can't do it manually. So for loops typically loop through a specific number of times, and while loops loop until a condition is false.
So now let's talk about integrating JavaScript into HTML. So the simplest way to write short chunks of JavaScript in code is by adding them directly into your HTML file with a script tag. Script tags can also go anywhere in the body, and you can have multiple of them or place all of your functions inside a single tag. We can define functions and reference them to run after an event, like clicking a button or scrolling. So for example, we can put our JavaScript within the body tag, and right here we have our function hello, and it'll work just fine. On the other hand, we can create an external JavaScript file, where our second option is to write JavaScript code by placing it in its own file. So oftentimes we're going to be working with large amounts of code, and it's usually the better approach to maintain keeping clean code by separating the JavaScript from the HTML. So we can link an internal JavaScript file very similarly using the source attribute inside of a script tag with the file path. We can use our function names to define actions just like before. For example, let's say that this is our HTML file. We have again, we have our script tag inside of the body. Instead of writing the function out, instead are referencing to a JavaScript file. And then over here, we can pretend that this is our JavaScript file, and we have our function from earlier in here. So to summarize, when we want to run some JavaScript code on a website, we have two options. You can directly write in your HTML file using the script tag, or you can link separate JavaScript files using the source attribute in the script tag. We can reference function names from our JavaScript code to define what actions take place after a specific event. So we hope that you guys found this workshop very informative, and thank you for watching.